In the winter of 1981, 8 native loggers vanished from a remote work site deep in the forests of northern Alberta. For 29 years, no one knew where they had gone, or why the camp they'd been living in seemed to disappear with them. Then, in the spring of 2010, a commercial logging crew clearing a new tract stumbled across a small forest opening that shouldn't have been there. Inside it, the collapsed remains of wooden bunkhouses, a rusted company truck, and tools left exactly where they had been set down nearly 3 decades earlier. What they found next would raise more questions than it answered, and reopen a case that had long been written off as a winter tragedy. By December 1981, snow was already waist-deep along the logging roads that snaked north from the town of Clearwater into company land leased by Iron Pine Lumber. The work site, Camp 6, was one of the most remote the company had ever operated. No permanent road connected it to the nearest settlement. Supplies came in by snowcat or by convoy of heavy-duty trucks whenever the weather allowed. The 8 men assigned there were all members of the Clearwater Cree Nation, experienced woodsmen who had worked for Iron Pine for several seasons. They were known by name in the town: Leonard Leo Spence, 31, the foreman; brothers Daniel and Peter Littlefox, 28 and 26; Joseph Tallman, 34, the mechanic; Robert Bobby Crow, 25, the youngest sawyer; Matthew Running Horse, 29, Walter Greyeyes, 33, and Samuel Two Feathers, 30. All were strong, capable, and used to the long isolation of winter logging. That month's contract called for felling a stand of old-growth spruce on the far side of Willow Creek, a project expected to take 3 months. They were dropped off in early December with 2 weeks' worth of food, fuel for the generators, and orders to radio in twice a week to base. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed routine. The December 7th radio check-in reported heavy snow but good progress. December 10th, Leo Spence mentioned in passing that they'd heard distant machinery at night. A strange comment, given that Camp 6 was the only active site in that sector. The December 14th call never came. At first, base assumed the storm that week had knocked out their generator or damaged the camp's radio aerial. Delays weren't unusual. They'd had similar blackouts in past winters. But when the December 17th call also failed to come, the company dispatched a snowcat with 2 drivers to check on the camp. The team never made it. 4 miles from Camp 6, they found the access trail completely blocked by downed trees. Spruce and pine toppled in a way that didn't match windfall patterns. The men cut their way through for several hours before realizing they were running low on fuel and had to turn back. The company decided to wait for the storm to pass. By December 20th, with no word from Camp 6 and worsening weather, they called the RCMP detachment in Clearwater. The Mounties sent in their own tracked vehicle, this time bringing an experienced search team. The trail they cut followed the same blocked path the company crew had encountered. When they finally reached the coordinates for Camp 6, they found only an empty clearing. No bunkhouses, no tool sheds, no company truck. The snow in the center of the site was unnaturally flat, without the telltale mounds that should have marked buried structures. It was as if the camp had never been there at all. A few objects did turn up. A fuel drum half buried in snow, its seal unbroken. A single axe, its blade nicked from use, and a broken coffee mug half hidden in a drift. But there were no footprints, no drag marks, no snowshoe trails leading away. RCMP reports from that week noted no immediate evidence of foul play, and speculated that the men might have evacuated ahead of the storm, trying to reach Clearwater on foot. A theory the families immediately rejected. No seasoned logger would attempt a 40-mile trek through heavy snow without notifying base, and the supplies left behind suggested they had no intention of leaving. Over the next month, search teams combed the surrounding forest, extending out in concentric circles. Not a single trace of the men, or the missing camp buildings was found. By February 1982, with winter still holding the land in its grip, the search was officially called off. Iron Pine Lumber closed Camp 6's file, marking it abandoned, personnel missing, presumed dead. The families buried empty coffins that spring. But in the years that followed, stories persisted among hunters and trappers who worked those woods. Strange shapes glimpsed in the trees, the sound of distant chopping where no active logging site existed, and the faint smell of diesel drifting on still nights. For the next 29 years, Camp 6 remained a name in an old file drawer, one of dozens of winter tragedies in Canada's north. Until the spring of 2010, when a new logging permit opened land less than 2 miles from the original site, and the forest finally gave back its secret. The new permit granted to Clearcut Resources in early 2010 was nothing unusual on paper. A block of mixed spruce and aspen, 30-year-old regrowth, bordered on the east by Willow Creek and on the west by a shallow ridge. What wasn't on the paper was its proximity to where the old Iron Pine maps had once marked Camp 6. To the younger loggers on Clearcut's crew, that name meant nothing. To the older hands, it was a quiet footnote in local lore, a story told over coffee about a camp that just wasn't there when the Mounties came looking. None of them expected to see any trace of it. Nearly 3 decades of regrowth and snowpack have a way of erasing human footprints. By late March, the crew had cleared a narrow access trail to the center of the block. The air still carried a bite of winter, but the snow was receding fast. One team was sent ahead with skidders to begin pulling marked timber out toward the staging yard. It was just before noon on March 26th when one of the skidder operators, a man named Dave Holbrook, noticed an odd break in the tree line ahead. It wasn't the kind of clean cut their saw teams made. This was a rounded clearing, maybe 60 feet across, ringed with saplings that looked far younger than the surrounding forest. The snow here was thin, the ground uneven beneath patches of dead grass. As Holbrook idled forward, his front tire caught on something solid just below the surface. He climbed down to check and found the edge of a wooden plank jutting out from under a mat of moss and soil. It was old, weathered to a silvery gray, but the saw cuts were clean, man-made. The other skidder pulled alongside. Together, the men began kicking away the moss and dirt. Within minutes, they'd uncovered the collapsed frame of what had once been a bunkhouse wall. The boards were still held together by rusted nails. One corner bore the faint outline of white painted numbers. C6B2. Word spread quickly back down the trail. By the time the foreman arrived, the crew had fanned out, uncovering more fragments. The warped metal of a wood stove door, half of an enamel wash basin, and, near the base of a small spruce, the remains of a chainsaw. Its casing was cracked, the metal pitted with rust, but a faded cereal plate still clung to one side. The foreman called a halt to work in that sector and got on the radio to company headquarters. It didn't take long for the term Camp 6 to pass from one mouth to another. By mid-afternoon, Clearcut's manager had instructed the crew to photograph everything and secured the site until the RCMP could be notified. When Constable Mark Ridley and his partner arrived the next morning, they came prepared for little more than a curiosity. That changed within minutes of stepping into the clearing. Under the thawing ground, the outlines of several buildings were visible as depressions in the soil. The old bunkhouse was the largest, but there were others. A smaller rectangle that might have been a tool shed, a square foundation that fit the dimensions of a cookhouse. And then there was the truck. Half hidden beneath a tangle of saplings on the clearing's northern edge, its olive green paint nearly swallowed by rust, sat what was unmistakably a 1970s Ford F600. The body was intact, though the tires had rotted down to wire and cloth. On the driver's side door, barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint, was the Iron Pine Lumber logo, a stylized pine tree with the company name in block letters. Ridley circled the vehicle slowly. The driver's door was closed, the handle stiff with corrosion. The glass was gone from the window frame. Inside, the bench seat was collapsed, the springs exposed, and a scattering of dead leaves lay where the cushion had been. The glove box, surprisingly, was still shut. When he coaxed it open, a brittle sheaf of papers slid out. Maintenance logs, the latest dated December 10, 1981. That date matched the last confirmed radio call from the missing men. Ridley looked up at his partner. "This isn't just an old camp," he said quietly. "This is their camp." The RCMP sealed the area and brought in a forensics team from Edmonton. What had begun as a routine logging job was now officially a crime scene, albeit one nearly 3 decades old. Within days, word had spread to Clearwater and, from there, to the families of the missing. Some came to the site themselves, standing at the clearing's edge as officers in white coveralls sifted through layers of soil and debris. For the first time in 29 years, there was something tangible: wood, metal, objects that had last been touched by the 8 men everyone thought the forest had swallowed whole. But as Ridley knew from experience, rediscovery rarely meant resolution. And in the case of Camp 6, every artifact the team uncovered seemed to raise a new question about what had really happened that winter. The Edmonton Forensics Unit arrived in the clearing with the methodical patience of people who knew their work would take days, maybe weeks. The first priority was to map the site exactly as it had been found. They used GPS markers to grid the clearing into numbered squares, each to be examined inch by inch. Constable Ridley stood back as the team began with the bunkhouse remains. Decades of snow and thaw had warped the boards into strange angles, but the outline was clear enough. Beneath what had been the south wall, one technician's trowel hit something metallic. Carefully brushing away the soil, she revealed a small enamel coffee mug, its handle missing. Inside was a thick plug of frozen dirt. Ridley bagged it anyway. Coffee mugs had been one of the only objects found in the 1981 search, but this one was in far better condition. By midday, they had a table laid out with tagged finds: rusted cutlery, a few cracked plates, 3 fuel cans still capped and half full. But the most telling discovery came from the far corner of the cookhouse foundation. There, beneath layers of pine needles and earth, they uncovered a boot. It was a heavy, steel-toe work boot, the leather shrunken and stiff. The laces had rotted away. Inside, still lodged in the heel cup, was a crumpled sock. Ridley knelt to examine the boot size, 10-1-2, the kind issued to logging crews by the company. No bones were inside, but the boot alone was enough to set off a ripple of unease among the searchers. Not far from the boot, another officer found a small ring of scorched earth. The surrounding soil bore no sign of a fire pit, just a patch where the earth was blackened and baked hard, as if burned with an intense, localized heat. That detail would nag at Ridley for months. The truck yielded its own surprises. When forensics examined the glove box papers more closely, they found notes in Leo Spence's handwriting, basic fuel tallies, equipment checklists, but also a loose sheet that looked like part of a letter. The ink had bled, but a few phrases stood out. "We heard it again last night, and can't risk moving the trucks." There was no signature, but the page ended abruptly, as if torn from a longer note. The chainsaw serial plate turned out to be gold for identification. A call to Iron Pine's old warehouse confirmed it had been issued to Joseph Tallman in October 1981. The warehouse manager, a man in his 70s, remembered Tallman well. "Best mechanic we had," he said. "Wouldn't have left that saw unless something bad happened." Over the next week, the clearing gave up more, A bent axe head, a tin of coffee still sealed, the flattened remains of a wool blanket. In the tool shed footprint, they found rows of rusted nails scattered like spilled seeds, all pointing in the same direction. A detail the forensic lead, Dr. Elaine Havers, found curious. "It's like they were yanked out at once," she remarked. But the most unsettling moment came on the 5th day, when an officer probing near the cookhouse foundation hit something hollow. Clearing the dirt revealed a large, dented metal drum. It was capped, but the cap was loose. Inside was not fuel or oil, but clothing, shirts, coats, gloves, all of them waterlogged but recognizably the heavy winter gear issued to the loggers. Each piece had been carefully folded, though some were stained with what looked, in the dim light, like dark brown streaks. Tests later would confirm those stains were human blood, though too degraded for DNA profiling. When the news reached the families, the reaction was mixed. Some took it as proof the men had been victims of violence. Others clung to the idea that the clothes might have been left behind deliberately, perhaps swapped out for dry gear after an accident. Ridley wasn't sure what to think. The drum was a puzzle. If the men had perished in the forest, why was so much of their gear together in one place, hidden? And if they had walked away, why take nothing with them? As the days went on, another pattern emerged. Despite the sheer volume of objects being recovered, there was one category conspicuously absent. Not a single personal item, no wallets, no watches, no photographs, had been found. It was as if whoever left the camp had taken every trace of individual identity with them. That absence would become the pivot point in Ridley's investigation, steering him toward a theory that no one in Clearwater had voiced aloud in nearly 30 years. The RCMP station in Clearwater kept its archives in a converted storage room behind the main office. Metal filing cabinets lined both walls, their drawers stuffed with yellowing reports, Polaroids, and carbon copy forms from decades past. Ridley had been in the room before, but never with a key to the locked cabinet marked Inactive Major Incidents. On April 5th, a week after the camp's discovery, he used that key for the first time. The Camp 6 file was thinner than Ridley expected, barely 2 inches thick. For a disappearance involving 8 men and a missing work site, the paper trail was almost skeletal. The initial incident report from December 20th, 1981, described the Snowcat team's failure to reach the camp due to fallen trees. The follow-up, dated December 23rd, confirmed the RCMP had found no structures at designated coordinates. There were a few grainy photographs, a blurred shot of the empty clearing, a close-up of the fuel drum they'd found that winter, and what looked like the axe head recovered in 1981. Strangely, the photos were stamped property of Iron Pine Lumber, not RCMP. The most telling document was a memo from Sergeant Henry Drummond, the detachment commander at the time, addressed to the provincial headquarters in Edmonton. It read, in part, "Given the extreme conditions and absence of physical evidence, continued search efforts are unlikely to yield results. Recommend formal closure of file and classification as presumed fatalities due to exposure." Ridley frowned. He'd read plenty of closure memos before, but this one felt rushed. The date was January 12, 1982, barely 3 weeks after the initial search, and there was no mention of interviewing families, former co-workers, or anyone who might have seen the men before they vanished. Tucked in the back of the folder was a handwritten list, the 8 loggers' names, next to each a single word. Most were ordinary, married, single, widower, but 2 stood out. Next to Walter Greyeyes, the word troublemaker. Next to Leo Spence, foreman, critical. It was an odd choice of descriptors. Ridley dug deeper, requesting access to related files, anything mentioning Iron Pine Lumber or its employees in 1981. That's when he found a slim envelope marked Miss So Unfiled. Inside was a photocopy of a company requisition form, dated December 3, 1981, ordering 4 55-gallon drums, contents unspecified, for delivery to Camp 6. The form was signed by a regional manager named Robert K. Hayes. There was no record of those drums in the inventory logs found in the truck glove box. Ridley decided to track down anyone still alive who had been part of the original search. The first was retired Constable Paul Renner, who in 1981 had been a rookie fresh out of depot. Renner remembered the case vividly. "We thought we'd find bodies, plain and simple," he said over coffee at a roadside diner. "But when we got there," he paused, shaking his head, "there was nothing. And I mean nothing. Even the ground didn't look right, like it had been scraped clean." Renner claimed that on their second day at the site, a pair of Iron Pine executives arrived unannounced by helicopter. They told Sergeant Drummond they were there to assist with identifying equipment. "We were told to clear the area for an hour. When we came back, the only thing left was that fuel drum and the axe." Ridley pressed him. Did he think the company removed something? Renner wouldn't commit, but his expression said enough. The next lead took Ridley to the Clearwater Band office, where he met Daniel Littlefox's younger sister, Marlene. She was in her 60s now, but she remembered the winter her brothers vanished. "They weren't just loggers," she said. "They were thinking about unionizing, better pay, safer camps. Leo was the one pushing for it." That detail wasn't in any RCMP report. Neither was her claim that a week before the disappearance, Daniel had come into town saying they'd been told to stop cutting in a particular tract of forest because company business needed privacy there. By the time Ridley left the band office, a picture was beginning to form, one that had less to do with a freak winter storm and more to do with the kind of decisions made in closed-door meetings far from the people whose lives they would change. The discovery of the camp had reopened an old wound, but it was also peeling back layers the original investigation had left untouched. And Ridley was starting to believe that if the truth had been buried, it hadn't been the snow that covered it. The snowmelt came early that April, turning the ground in and around the Camp 6 clearing into a soft, cold slurry. For Ridley, it was a blessing. As the frost released its grip, things hidden deep in the soil began to surface. The forensic crew, now working with a team of archaeology students from the University of Alberta, shifted from heavy tools to fine work: trowels, brushes, sifters. Every new inch revealed splinters of wood, bits of canvas, and the occasional rusted tool head. But on April 14th, they found something that stopped everyone. It was buried under the northwest corner of the collapsed cookhouse, in what might once have been a shallow storage pit. The first sign was a scrap of darkened fabric, wedged between two planks. When the technician pulled it free, the fabric unfurled into the sleeve of a heavy winter parka, navy blue, lined with quilted wool. The left shoulder bore a small, hand-stitched patch of a red feather. Marlene Littlefox would later confirm it had belonged to her brother Daniel. She had sewn that patch herself as a gift before he left for the season. The parka sleeve was stiff with frozen earth, but it hadn't been cut or torn. Instead, the wrist cuff was still drawn tight, cinched with its original elastic. Inside the sleeve, pressed deep into the lining, was a fragment of bone. It was less than 2 inches long, pale against the dark wool, but the forensic anthropologist on site identified it immediately as human. The search became more intense. Within hours, in the same pit, they uncovered 3 more bone fragments: 2 phalanges and part of a metacarpal, likely from a human hand. All were consistent with adult male remains. The condition suggested they had been protected from the elements, not lying exposed for decades. For Dr. Havers, the lead forensic pathologist, this was enough to change the case's classification. "This is no longer a missing persons recovery," she told Ridley quietly. "You're looking at a probable homicide." The bones were sent to Edmonton for analysis. While they waited, Ridley focused on the other objects emerging from the clearing. In the footprint of the tool shed, a student sifting through damp soil found a short length of chain. At first glance, it was ordinary logging gear, until they saw that one end was looped through a heavy steel padlock. The shank bent and twisted as if it had been forced open. Nearby, in the same square, lay the headlamp assembly from a snowcat. The glass was shattered, the metal dented inward. When Ridley examined it, he noticed faint specks of what looked like dried paint along the rim. Paint that, under a field test, came back as the same olive green used on Iron Pine's fleet of trucks in 1981. The implications were troubling. The padlocked chain suggested something, or someone, had been secured here. The snowcat headlamp hinted at a collision, damage sustained in the camp itself. Then came the most peculiar find. Under a shallow layer of loam in the center of the clearing, they found a company-issued first aid kit, its canvas case stiff but intact. Inside, the bandages were still wrapped, the antiseptic bottles unbroken. But beneath the gauze and adhesive strips was something that had no business being there. A small, oil-stained notebook. The notebook's cover was plain, its pages filled with short, blocky handwriting. Many entries were mundane: dates, weather notes, tally marks for logs cut. But the final entry, dated December 9th, 1981, stood out. "He came again last night, stayed at the edge. Leo says keep the lights off after midnight. Daniel doesn't want to. Hayes is coming tomorrow with the drums. Can't be here when they arrive." Ridley read the entry 3 times. Hayes could only be Robert K. Hayes, the regional manager whose name was on the requisition form for those 4 mystery drums. And if Hayes had been bringing them personally to Camp 6, the visit was never recorded in company logs. When Ridley called Hayes for comment, he got a polite but firm refusal. "That was a long time ago, Constable. I don't recall every delivery I made." When pressed, Hayes ended the call. The lab results from Edmonton came back 2 days later. The bone fragments from the parka sleeve were confirmed to be human, belonging to a male of indigenous ancestry, aged between 25 and 35 at time of death. The estimate fit at least 5 of the missing men, including Daniel Littlefox. The cause of death couldn't be determined, but there was no evidence of animal predation. For the families, the news was both a breakthrough and a fresh wound. For Ridley, it was a confirmation that the men of Camp 6 had not simply walked into the forest and been swallowed by winter. They had been prevented from leaving. But the question that hung in the air, heavier than the spring thaw, was why. And in the shadows of that clearing, with each new artifact pulled from the earth, Ridley felt the answer drawing closer. By late April, the Camp 6 site was cordoned off under a full RCMP crime scene order. Clear-Cut Resources had suspended work indefinitely, and the forest clearing that had been silent for 29 years now hummed daily with the low chatter of investigators, the snap of camera shutters, and the constant scrape of trowels through damp earth. Ridley, however, was spending more time away from the site. The artifacts were telling one story, but he needed the voices that had been ignored or silenced in 1981. The name at the center of his notes, circled twice in red ink, was Robert K. Hayes. He began with flight records. In 1981, Iron Pine Lumber had chartered a Bell 206 helicopter through a small air service in Fort McMurray. The owner, a weathered man named Carl Becker, was still alive and running the same outfit out of a tin hangar on the edge of town. Over coffee, at a scarred wooden desk, Becker thumbed through a box of old trip manifests. "Here," he said, tapping one sheet. The log showed 2 December flights to Camp 6 Clearing in the span of 5 days. The first, on December 4th, listed only supplies as cargo. The second, on December 10th, was more cryptic: cargo, barrels, passengers, R.K. Hayes plus 1. The Bossa 1 was unmarked. "What happened to your return flight that day?" Ridley asked, noting the blank in the log. Becker leaned back, frowning. "Never made it. Weather came in fast. Hayes said they'd bunk there and radio for pickup when it cleared. We never heard from them again. Figured they got out some other way. But there were no records of any other aircraft pickups in that region for the rest of December 1981. Ridley's next visit was to Clearwater's oldest remaining trapper, Albert "Al" Whitecloud, who in 1981 had been running lines along Willow Creek. Sitting by his wood stove, Al listened silently as Ridley laid out the timeline. When Ridley mentioned the date December 10th, Al's eyes narrowed. "That was the night I saw the lights," he said. "Helicopter came in low just after dark. No running lights, just a glow from the cabin. Set down in the open by the creek, must have been near your Camp 6. I stayed back, heard shouting, metal on metal. Then nothing, lights out." "Did you see anyone leave?" Al shook his head. "But I saw something else the next morning. Smoke. Thin, not a campfire, like something burning slow. By the time I got closer, it was gone." The slow-burn smoke gnawed at Ridley's thoughts as he drove back to the detachment. Combined with the scorched earth patch in the clearing, it suggested an intentional fire, one that hadn't been meant to signal for help. 2 days later, the forensic crew added another piece to the puzzle. While clearing the area around the rusted F600 truck, they uncovered a long metal pry bar wedged under the rear axle. The bar's tip was bent, and along its shaft were faint smears of green paint, matching the Snowcat headlamp assembly found earlier. On the opposite end, under the grime, they found something more disturbing: a dark, flaked residue that field tests indicated was dried blood. The pry bar, when measured, was consistent with a tool kept in every iron pine truck for emergency repairs. But why would it be left jammed into the truck's undercarriage? That night, Ridley spread his files across his kitchen table, connecting lines between names, objects, and dates. The December 10th helicopter, the barrels, the missing personal effects, the scorched earth, the pry bar with blood, and now the human bones in Daniel's parka sleeve. Every thread pointed to something happening that night: an event involving Hayes, an unidentified second passenger, and at least one of the loggers resisting whatever plan had been in motion. The next morning, Ridley tracked down Hayes's former secretary, a retired woman named Lorraine Hughes. At first, she was guarded, but when Ridley mentioned the Camp 6 discovery, her tone shifted. "Hayes had me type up a shipment memo that week," she recalled. "He dictated it like it was nothing, but I remember the wording. Delivery of material for containment project. Priority confidential. He told me to file it in the private cabinet, not the regular logs, and then he shredded the carbon copy himself." Lorraine's memory of the phrase containment project lodged itself in Ridley's mind. It didn't fit any normal logging operation. Containment of what? Fuel spill? Wildlife? Something else entirely? Back at the clearing, the crew was working a patch of ground near the ridge. One of the archaeology students waved Ridley over. From the soil, she had just pulled a crumpled aluminum ID tag, its letters barely legible under corrosion. Ridley crouched, brushing dirt away until the stamping came clear. Spence, L. Foreman, C6. Leo Spence's tag. It was found 30 feet from the cookhouse foundation, half buried as if dropped mid-stride. And like everything else that had surfaced from the camp, it seemed to be pointing Ridley toward one conclusion: that whatever happened on the night of December 10, 1981, had been swift, violent, and meticulously cleaned up. What he didn't yet know was that the next section of disturbed earth the crew would open would contain the most direct link yet between Robert Hayes, those barrels, and the fate of all 8 men. The discovery came on April 28th, in the southern edge of the clearing where the moss-covered ground sloped gently toward Willow Creek. The archaeology students had been probing with soil augers, mapping areas of unusual resistance. In one spot, about 12 feet from the cookhouse footprint, the auger struck metal at barely 2 feet down. The first shovels revealed the curve of a rust-streaked drum, 55 gallons, just like the requisition form from December 3, 1981. Excitement rippled through the crew, but protocol slowed them. The RCMP called in their hazardous materials unit from Edmonton, wary of old fuel or chemicals. When the hazmat team arrived, they cleared a wide perimeter and began digging carefully around the barrel. Soon, the top half emerged. Olive green paint blistered with rust, the faint stencil of iron pine lumber still visible along the rim. But there was something else. Beneath the company name, in faded black letters, the word bio, and the fragment of another word ending in Agard. The hazmat lead, a stocky man named Kerrigan, exchanged a look with Ridley. "Biohazard," he said flatly. By late afternoon, they had exposed not 1, but 3 identical barrels in a loose cluster. The lids were sealed with thick rubber gaskets, remarkably intact. Kerrigan's team ran quick surface tests. No radiation, no explosive vapors. Only then did they pry open the first barrel. The smell hit first. Even after decades, it had a sweet, acrid tang that made eyes water. Inside was a slurry of blackened cloth, twisted metal fragments, and something pale that caught the light. Kerrigan reached in with tongs and lifted out a scrap of fabric, dark blue, quilted wool lining, identical to the parka sleeve that had held Daniel Littlefox's bone fragment. In the second barrel, beneath a layer of sodden canvas, they found more cloth, plaid shirts, heavy work pants, and interspersed among them, bones. Long bones, ribs, vertebrae. Many were fragmented, some showing signs of heat exposure, edges discolored and brittle. The forensic anthropologist on scene began laying them out on clean tarps, counting softly under her breath. By the time they emptied the second barrel, she was certain, remains from at least 3 individuals. The third barrel held the most chilling contents. Beneath the same slurry of cloth and metal was a dented steel hard hat, its interior webbing stained dark. Wedged beside it was a small leather wallet, the stitching rotted but the contents surprisingly intact. Inside were a faded family photo, a folded $10 bill from 1980, and a Clearwater Band ID card for Walter Greyeyes. Ridley stood over the barrels, the spring air cool against his face, and felt the case shift under his feet. This was no longer just a disappearance. It was physical proof that the men of Camp 6 had been killed, their bodies concealed in industrial containers, and those containers deliberately buried. The question now was why. Kerrigan's team sealed the barrels and transported them under guard to Edmonton for full analysis. The site was expanded, and ground-penetrating radar was brought in. Initial sweeps suggested at least 1 more buried object of similar size on the far side of the clearing. That night, Ridley reviewed every note, every interview, every scrap of evidence. The December 10th helicopter, Hayes and the unnamed passenger, the memo about a containment project, the scorched earth, the missing personal effects, now explained perhaps by the contents of those barrels. It was possible that the barrels themselves had been the delivery Hayes was making that night. Or perhaps they'd been brought in after. Whatever happened, but the label, biohazard, would be difficult for the company to explain away as standard logging gear. Before he left the detachment for the night, Ridley called Marlene Littlefox. He told her they'd found more of Daniel's clothing and that the remains were being examined. She was quiet for a long time, then said, "They thought the forest would keep their secret, but the forest doesn't forget." The next morning, the radar team began work over the fourth anomaly. By noon, the outline of the final barrel was visible in the soil, and from its position, barely a foot from the cookhouse wall, Ridley had the uneasy sense that whatever it contained might tell him exactly what had happened inside Camp 6 on that frozen December night. The fourth barrel was closer to the surface than the others. Its top was barely 8 inches below the moss. By mid-morning on April 30th, the crew had cleared enough soil for the hazmat team to secure it. Unlike the previous 3, this drum's lid wasn't bolted. It had been hammered down crudely, as if whoever buried it had been in a hurry. Kerrigan's men worked carefully, easing the seal open with a flat bar. The moment the lid gave way, a sharper, more chemical odor rolled out. Less decay, more industrial. Inside was no slurry of cloth and bone this time, but layers of heavy plastic sheeting wrapped tight around a large object. They lifted the bundle out in sections. The first layers of plastic were opaque, but as they cut them away, something metallic gleamed through. A rectangular case, painted the same olive green as Iron Pine's trucks, with stenciled letters in black. "Do not open, hazmat. Clearance level 3. It wasn't a tool chest. When the forensics team opened the latches, the contents were nothing they had expected. Inside were 8 small vials in a foam insert, each sealed with wax and labeled with faded typewriter strips. Sample A1, sample A2 through A8. The liquid inside each was cloudy, pale yellow. Beneath the vials was a clipboard with water-damaged papers still legible in places. The top sheet bore a heading, Iron Pine Lumber, Biological Containment Report. Confidential. The first paragraph, though partially smeared, contained words that sent a ripple through everyone crowded around. Test exposure results inconclusive. Isolate subjects from outside contact until further instruction. Ridley's stomach sank. Subjects. Not crew, not employees, subjects. The report was dated December 8, 1981, 2 days before the helicopter sighting, 2 days before the men of Camp 6 were last heard from. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, R.K. Hayes. The remaining pages were worse. They listed each of the 8 loggers by name alongside a column marked Condition. Some entries read Baseline, others Monitoring Symptoms. Next to Walter Greyeyes, Elevated Temp, Isolate. Next to Daniel Littlefox, Resistant, Observe Closely. The last page was brief. Pending directive from HQ, if containment compromised, initiate neutralization protocol, disposal as per standard. Ridley stepped away from the barrel, the cool air suddenly too thin. It was no longer a question of foul play. It was an execution order disguised as corporate procedure. The biohazard label wasn't just for show. These men had been exposed to something, intentionally or otherwise, and when that exposure risked reaching the outside world, the company had chosen to eliminate them rather than call in medical help. The discovery hit the families like a second loss. The possibility that their brothers, fathers, and sons had been experimented on, or at least treated as experimental data, was a truth almost harder to bear than the murders themselves. Kerrigan sealed the vials and documents in secure containment cases for transport to a federal lab. The RCMP notified the provincial coroner's office, and within hours, word had reached the Ministry of Justice. A full inquiry into Iron Pine's historical operations was announced that evening. But for Ridley, there was still one piece missing. Who was the +1 on that December 10th flight manifest? the unknown passenger who might have been the scientist or executive behind the HQ directive. Without that name, the chain of accountability stopped with Hayes, and Ridley had no illusions about how quickly Hayes's lawyers would claim loss of memory when the questions came. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the clearing, Ridley stood by the open barrel, the edges of the green case catching the last light. For nearly 3 decades, the forest had hidden this object, along with the truth of Camp 6. Now, with the final barrel unearthed, the story was no longer rumor or legend. It was evidence. Evidence that could finally bring the weight of the law against the people who had once thought this place remote enough, silent enough, to erase 8 lives without a trace. What he didn't yet realize was that the answer to the +1 was waiting for him in the oldest place possible. In the mind of someone who had been there that night, seen everything, and lived to carry the memory into the present. The lead came from a place Ridley hadn't expected, an offhand comment during a follow-up interview with Becker, the helicopter charter owner. They were reviewing the December 10th manifest again when Becker, squinting at the faded handwriting, muttered, "Funny, I always thought the second fella looked too clean for a logger. City type. Wore a long wool coat, leather gloves, didn't say much. Hayes did all the talking." Ridley leaned forward. "You remember his name?" Becker shook his head. "Never introduced himself, but when we landed, I heard Hayes call him Doctor." That single word cracked open an entirely new path. Back at the detachment, Ridley dug into provincial licensing records for 1981, cross-referencing doctors with contracts to private companies. In less than an hour, he found one. Dr. Charles M. Fenton, a microbiologist whose lab at the time had been subcontracted to several resource companies for environmental impact studies. His name also appeared, once, in a provincial safety report tied to iron pine lumber. The date on that report, November 1981. Fenton had retired to Vancouver Island years earlier. 2 days later, Ridley was on a ferry, the case file thick in his satchel. He found Fenton in a modest seaside home, hair white, frame bent with age but eyes still sharp. The old man answered the door warily, but when Ridley introduced himself and mentioned Camp 6, Fenton's face drained of color. I signed non-disclosures," he said, retreating toward the kitchen. Ridley laid the photocopy of the biological containment report on the table, the signature of R.K. Hayes stark at the bottom. "This was in a sealed barrel, along with remains. You were there, December 10th. Tell me what happened." For a long time, Fenton just stared at the paper. Then he exhaled, slow and shaky. "They'd been cutting in an area slated for a soil remediation study," he began. Hayes wanted to keep it quiet. There were concerns about an old military dump site from the 50s. When the first crew started getting sick, fever, nausea, Hayes called me in to assess. But by the time I arrived, it wasn't just illness. Some of the men, their behavior was off, disoriented, agitated. One, gray eyes, accused Hayes of lying to them, said they were being poisoned. Ridley kept silent, letting him continue. "I told Hayes they needed to be evacuated, quarantined in a proper facility. He said that wasn't an option. Too many questions. He got on the radio to HQ. I never knew who that meant. The order came back. Neutralize the risk. That night, there was shouting outside my cabin. When I stepped out, 2 men were already down. The others were being herded toward the trucks. One tried to run. Hayes hit him with a pry bar. After that..." Fenton's voice cracked. "They brought the barrels." Ridley felt the room tilt slightly. "You're saying you saw them killed?" Fenton nodded, eyes wet. "I didn't help, but I didn't stop it either. In the morning, Hayes told me to write up the report you found. Then he flew me out. I've carried it every day since. Why didn't you come forward? They would have buried me too, and maybe my family." Ridley recorded every word, knowing it might be the closest thing to a confession he'd ever get from someone on that ridge in 1981. But he also knew Fenton's testimony, without corroboration, would be attacked as the ramblings of an old man. When he returned to Clearwater, Ridley went straight to the excavation site. The lab reports on the barrels were back. The liquid traces inside tested positive for a mix of industrial solvents and degraded organophosphate compounds, chemicals used in both pesticides and nerve agents. The soil around the burial sites showed elevated levels too. That meant Camp 6 hadn't just been a logging camp. It had been sitting on top of toxic ground. The containment project wasn't about wildlife or fuel. It was about keeping the contamination and the company's role in disturbing it out of public view. As Ridley looked over the clearing, now marked with numbered stakes and evidence tents, he knew Part 10 would have to be the reckoning. Taking the story from this silent patch of forest to a courtroom, forcing the names Hayes and Fenton and everyone else complicit into the open. But it was also the most dangerous step. Iron Pine Lumber had been bought out years ago by a multinational giant with deep pockets and deeper influence, and they would fight to make sure the truth of Camp 6 stayed buried. The inquiry hearings began in late September, held in a converted community hall in Edmonton. Rows of folding chairs were packed with reporters, legal teams, and the families of the 8 men from Camp 6. At the front, under the glare of television lights, sat the panel. 3 commissioners appointed by the Ministry of Justice. Robert K. Hayes was the first major witness called. Time had thinned his hair and added lines to his face, but his posture was still the same. Shoulders square, chin lifted, a man used to being in control. His lawyer objected to nearly every question Ridley's team put forward, citing the decades-old nature of the events, failing memory, and irrelevance to current corporate operations. But the evidence was relentless. The barrels, the biological containment report, the requisition forms, and, most damning, Dr. Fenton's sworn testimony played on a large screen. Though his voice trembled, Fenton's account matched the physical evidence detail for detail. The night of December 10th, the helicopter arrival, the sick men, the violence, the hurried burial. When the panel chair asked Hayes directly whether he had ordered the neutralization of the Camp 6 crew, his answer was a tight, "I acted in accordance with the safety protocols available at the time." That single sentence became front-page news the next morning. It was not a denial, it was an admission wrapped in corporate jargon. The hearing stretched for weeks. Former Iron Pine employees testified about secretive deliveries, sudden work stoppages, and unexplained payroll terminations in late 1981. A provincial toxicologist confirmed that the compounds found in the barrels could cause neurological symptoms matching those described by both Fenton and Al Whitecloud. Marlene Littlefox took the stand on the 3rd week. She spoke not of chemical compounds or corporate memos, but of her brother Daniel, the way he whistled when he worked, how he'd promised to buy their mother a proper wood stove after the winter season. They called it a containment project, she told the commissioners, her voice steady. But what they contained was 8 human lives, and they did it because those lives were native, and they thought no one would care enough to dig them up. By the time the hearings concluded, public outrage was palpable. The commissioners recommended criminal charges against Hayes for multiple counts of homicide, as well as charges of criminal negligence causing death. They also referred the case to federal authorities for investigation into potential violations of environmental and human experimentation laws. Hayes was arrested at his home in Calgary 2 weeks later. The image of him being led to a waiting RCMP cruiser, wrists cuffed, head lowered, was broadcast nationwide. Dr. Fenton, though granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, became a pariah in his community. He later wrote a public letter of apology to the families. The Camp 6 clearing was declared a protected historical site. A granite memorial was erected on the ridge, engraved with the names of all 8 men: Daniel Littlefox, Walter Greyeyes, Leo Spence, and the 5 others whose remains had been painstakingly matched through DNA. At the dedication ceremony, Marlene placed a small, hand-stitched red feather at the base of the stone, just like the one she'd sewn onto Daniel's parka all those years ago. Ridley stood at the edge of the crowd that day, the autumn air cool against his face. The forest behind the memorial was quiet, broken only by the rustle of leaves. He thought about how easily the truth could have remained hidden, how close it had come to being erased entirely. When the speeches ended, Marlene found him. "You kept your promise," she said simply. Ridley didn't answer right away. He looked past her to the ridge, where sunlight caught the tops of the pines, and felt the weight of every file, every shovel of dirt, every witness's trembling voice. Then he nodded. "Some things," he said, "should never stay buried."